If you want to make things that make things better, have fun doing it, and learn to help yourself and everyone around you flourish, well, you've come to the right place. Welcome to Enliven. This is the show where we explore what's possible and the people, the principles, and the practices that are going to help you build enlivening products and enlivening organizations. I'm your host, Andrew Scottsko, and this episode, my guest is Becky Baybrook. After getting her PhD in organizational psychology, Becky actually started her career working with the city of New Orleans. After that, she went into industry. But no matter where she worked, she's always pursued her goal of partnering with talented people at every level to create healthy work environments and bring out the best in people while building a solid business and pursuing a meaningful mission. To that end, Becky served as the Global Chief People Officer for companies across a range of industries, from big data to embedded control networks, solar energy, and microchip development. Most recently, she's focused her advisory work on life sciences and medical device companies. In short, she's one of the most experienced HR and cultural transformation leaders in Silicon Valley. When it comes to people and culture issues, she's pretty much seen it all. Becky starts her work from the belief that organizations and leaders reveal who they are in the ways that they respond to setbacks and tests of integrity. And she's spent decades helping people and companies through pivotal moments like this. In this conversation, Becky and I go deep on workplace culture. We explore some vexing questions around belonging, psychological safety, and how millennials are changing management. One area in particular that I think you'll find useful is a discussion we have about what the elements are that actually make up workplace culture. And then tactically, how can you get a good read on that culture from the outside if you're considering joining an organization? So whether you're in an organization as an individual contributor or a manager, or maybe you're in the market for a new role and really want to have a better sense of the culture in the organization you're thinking about joining, I think there's something here for you. With that, I give you Becky Baybrook. Enjoy. So first of all, welcome to the show, Becky. Thank you so much for making the time, and I'm really, really excited for this conversation. We're going to cover a lot of ground in this conversation, but so Becky, when you meet somebody right now, how do you explain to them, that classic of American questions of what you do? What would you say for people who don't already know you?
Well, it sort of depends on the context, but I see what I do as being about creating a workplace that brings out the best in people, and that brings out the best in people in service of a vision or a mission or a direction for an organization, and that organizations that are highly successful pay off for, of course, the customers or clients. They pay off for investors. But in order to do that, they really have to pay off for the people who are in them, who are making them work, from the lowest level up to the highest level. And so for me, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to create a healthy workplace that brings out the best in people across the entire hierarchy in service of a goal or a mission that matters.
I love it. That you just said so many of my favorite words in one nice, one beautifully concise package. That's how I think our friend Jeff said we should probably have a conversation, because he knows we're both very, very interested in that topic. So when you talk about that, what is, how did you get interested in this whole topic? Like, how did you get started, and what made you say, I want to go spend my time working on that?
Well, there's some of it is my personal biography, and some of it is just opportunities along the way. So I'll start with a little bit of my personal biography. So I grew up in Hawaii. Most of your listeners aren't going to be able to see me, so they don't know that I'm white. And so I'm what in Hawaii is called a haole. And so my family and I were, because we grew up in a very rural part of Hawaii, we were different. We didn't look like everybody else. So that's part of the story. The other part of the story is that my father was a minister. And so he was a pastor of churches, and churches are the ultimate in volunteer organizations.
Absolutely.
And so from a very young age, I was very interested in how people connect and relate to one another when they are very different, and how they connect and relate to a cause. In the church's case, there's always a very strong sense of mission and what the church is about. So that's the biographical part. I always knew that I wanted to study psychology. So I did that in undergrad. And then I knew I wanted to go on to do graduate work, and decided once I got into graduate school that what I really wanted to focus on was organizations and what happens to people in organizations. And one of my first jobs before I even finished my PhD was working with the New Orleans Police Department. And I know that's going to conjure up a lot of images in people's minds, but part of my role was to help them kind of sort out how to think about race-neutral hiring and promotional practices. And
when was this, by the way?
Oh, in the 60s. I mean, in the 70s.
Okay, so you were way ahead of most organizations in the curve.
Oh no, they were doing it because a court told them they had to. It was a result of a lawsuit.
Oh.
So
well then, never mind.
So this is about compliance. But I really got to see a whole bunch of interesting dynamics. And of course, anyone who knows New Orleans knows it's a fascinating set of cultures that have come together over time. So that was very formative. I got out of graduate school and got into a corporate environment where I was doing sort of the standard routine things that organizational psychologists do. I was doing executive assessments and attitude and opinion surveys and that kind of stuff. But over time, I decided I wanted to be much closer to what was going on in smaller organizations. And so I left the corporate world, took a fairly significant demotion to go become just a run-of-the-mill HR director in a high-tech company in Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. And began to see what happens to people in the trenches, on the front lines, whether it's a PhD engineer or a receptionist. And that's a world that I hadn't seen that clearly when I was in a corporate role where I was mostly working with CEOs and operating executives. And I began understanding how a throwaway line, an executive can just say something randomly off the cuff in a meeting or on his way out the door, but a receptionist or a frontline engineer or a graphics artist can hear that comment and interpret it in a way that the executive probably never meant. And it can have a ripple effect in organizations. And so I began to see the impact of kind of communication errors. And it wasn't because the executives intended to be harmful or hurtful, or because they were egotistical or any of those things we often think of executives as being. It was just that the two sides just weren't operating in the same world. And they weren't really talking to each other. And so I got more and more interested in how culture takes root. And the word culture to me gets overused. So I really like to think of it in terms of people practices. And what are our habits and our practices around all the people aspects of working together?
So I want to double click on that and go in there a little bit. So you're right. Culture is one of those terms that is obviously used all over the place, but in so many different ways. And so I just want to, just so we can be on the same page here, when you say culture, what do you mean by that? Like, do you have a definition you like?
Well, yes, most people do. I think culture is about the habits, the patterns of habits around the way people are expected to get things done and the way they actually get things done. And so there's a part of culture that's always aspirational, and there's a part of culture that's, how it really works. And in healthy organizations, they're clear. I mean, and they're willing to be honest about where that gap is. And so part of it is we talk about what the values are, and the values often tend to be aspirational, but they also should be expressed in terms of behaviors, like what does integrity really look like? And then there should be examples of how it's actually working right now, and how we're trying to bridge that gap, and how we as an organization are holding ourselves to high standards. So I think all of those behaviors and those conversations around behavior are what create the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard it often referred to as culture is, the way we do things around here. I often think of culture like an iceberg, right? Where there's this, there's the part of the iceberg you see, which is the very visible practices, the meetings, the rituals of the company, the practices. But then there's everything else, which is most of what there is, which is all the stuff that nobody tells you when you enter an organization. If your first day on the job, your first month, you start to pick it up, and then you're going, wait a minute, this is different. This is something about this isn't quite what I thought it was. So does that model or that metaphor fit with what you've seen, or how do you think about it?
The way I would describe that is, you're right, that's all culture. I think there's a continuum of unhealthy or dysfunctional culture, and then there's healthy and functional culture. And at the dysfunctional end, you see the very tip of the iceberg above the water. And there are lots of things that are hidden and not talked about and not discussed that you discover sort of in an underground way. In the healthy cultures, I think it's just more transparent. I mean, there's more of the iceberg is above the waterline. And people can talk about it safely, even talk about the things about the culture that they need to change, that aren't working well for them. And so that's how I would sort of footnote your definition.
I like that. So it's like the iceberg sort of metaphor works a little bit. It's almost like you can tell how healthy it is based on how much of the total you can see. So how opaque is the culture? And it seems like what you're saying is there's a balance between, or there's some trade-off between how much of all the way things really work is actually are they upfront about? Are they explicit about it? They tell you about?
Right. I think another piece of that, though, is the part of the culture that's aspirational. And I think people often forget this, that marketplaces change, technology changes. And so companies have to change. And that means sometimes the culture has to change, not because it was bad, not because it was toxic or dysfunctional, but because what it's going to take to survive and be successful just has to change. And so I think it's important not to forget that there's a piece of culture that should always be about aspiring to be better than we are in how we get things done.
I find that people sometimes get stuck on this idea that if you're reaching for something, you're unhappy with the way things are, or that something's wrong with the way things are. How do you deal with that in the conversations you have with when you work with an organization now, whether it's sort of in a large setting or if you're kind of doing maybe more one-on-one with executives or somebody you might be coaching?
Okay. So how tall were you when you were 10 years old?
Wow, I don't know. I was short. I was probably 4 foot something. Well, let's say 4'5". I don't know.
Okay. And how tall are you now?
5'11".
Okay. So was it bad to be 4'10" when you were 10 years old?
There were a few days, actually, yeah. If you really want to know, yeah, there were a couple days where it sort of sucked. Got picked last for basketball. It was rough. It was rough, man.
But there wasn't much you could do about it, right?
Nothing I could do about it. Yeah. No, there was nothing actually wrong.
Yeah. So
there were some stories I didn't like, but
Yeah. So I just tell people, get over this being so judgmental. That the judgmental part of what you just described, that this has to be good or bad, gets in our way. It just gets in our way so often, because what really we're talking about is things just need to be different. And that's just because of the world we find ourselves in. And sometimes there are good reasons. Sometimes there are things happening, dynamics that we wish weren't happening. But you have to accept what is around you and adapt to it and evolve to it. And well, this is getting off the topic a little bit, but one of my favorite books of all time, science books of all time, is The Beak of the Finch. If you've
no, I have not. Tell me about that.
It. So this is a book about evolution in the Galapagos, and it's probably one of the best books written about field research that describes evolution in action. And if you read it, and it's very, very well written, and you take it as a metaphor, or at least a thought experiment around how organizations change, it's really about animals adapting to their food sources. And so the shape of their beaks change from generation to generation. And it's just about, how do I get more food? How do I survive? And
how do I adapt to my environment and be fit for the new conditions? Right.
And so instead of thinking that that's a good or a bad thing, it's more about what's useful. What's useful. And it's very pragmatic. And I think we've lost some of that in organizations, or in the way people think about their lives now.
What do you make of that?
Oh, now we're getting philosophical, but I think it's in part because we live in a fairly polarized world where people feel like they have to take sides, or they have to have a deep cause that motivates and propels them. And there's a time and a place for all of that, for sure. But I also think there's something deeply satisfying about being able to get things done. And sometimes it's just, okay, what's the most practical way to get this done? And if it's different than the way I did it in the past, how do I learn how to do it? Or how do I find somebody else who can do it for me or help me see how to do it? And I think some of the cultures that are the healthiest are the ones that are most resilient, or the ones that are most flexible, and that separate out. Certainly, there are some things in life where there is a difference between good and bad. And when it comes to issues around integrity, for sure. But then there are other parts of life where, like communication. Okay, so sometimes it's better to have a group meeting, and sometimes it's better to talk to everyone one-on-one. And there's no inherently good or bad about either approach. It's just which one's going to work the best. And at different times, different things work better than others. And so let's not get too hung up about that. Right.
Kind of using the right tool for the job, so to speak.
Right. And I think, I've seen too many executives who are leading some kind of change in the organization get up and say, we're pivoting, we're going in a different direction. We're going to be eliminating 100 positions, so 100 of you aren't going to be here next week, and blah, blah, and or we're being taken over by somebody who's buying us. And it's all, the implicit message is, we did something wrong, or you did something wrong, and that's why we ended up here. And I think that's so unnecessary, because a lot of that is just, well, first of all, if I'm an employee sitting there listening to that speech, I'm saying, I didn't do anything wrong. You, Mr. CEO, did something wrong because you didn't figure this out. You're our leader. You're supposed to keep this from happening.
Yeah, you're supposed to protect us.
Yeah. But there's so much about the business world, and that's happens just by chance. It's fairly random, and so it's important to control the things we can control. But beating up on people or organizations, or saying that we were bad and now we're going to be good, it's just not useful.
Yeah. So I'm hoping you could give me an example, because I know you've seen such a wide range of business situations, right? You've seen turnarounds, you've seen mergers and acquisitions, you've seen shutdowns, you've seen startups, you've kind of seen it all. And, especially when we're talking about things in the world of technology, which a lot of the listeners of this show are involved with in some form or fashion, it's a volatile world. It's unpredictable. It's fast. It's complex. It's extraordinarily, that's one of the things people like about it, right? Is that it's so dynamic and interesting. But it does make this kind of thing a little bit more challenging. So what I'm hoping is, as you think back over, maybe you could help us understand, what is it like? So you kind of just painted a broad picture of what this looks like when it's probably not being done very well by whoever's leading this conversation and this sort of change effort. Maybe could you give me an example of, like, maybe a contrasted example of, here's what it looks like. Here's what people are likely, the traps that someone's likely to fall into when they're going through a difficult situation. And then how should they navigate that? How do they deal with those traps and avoid them?
A couple of things I think are important. One is the leadership of the organization. So I think of the organizations as having a bunch of people that are sort of between 0 and 1,000 feet off the ground. And they have, that much perspective. They can see that far towards the horizon because they're working in that, on those elevations. And they have assignments and responsibilities and ideas and expertise, and they're the engine, and you have to give them kind of enough direction so that they can really do what they're best at. And from people who are designing chips to people who are designing software to what I currently do most now, working with scientists who are researching cures for heart disease or neurological diseases, or doing drug development, that engine has to work well. And then you have sort of the middle of the pyramid, which are the people that are, I'd say, at about 1,000 to 5, 8, maybe even 10,000 feet. And they can see further, right? They can see more of the landscape. And it's their job to keep an eye on what in that landscape might be impacting the folks who are lower on the mountain, who are getting all this work done. And sometimes it's new technology that can make us more efficient. Sometimes it's competition, whatever. But at the very top of the pyramid are the executives and the leaders of the organization who have the farthest line of sight, both to see where the opportunities are, but where the risks are. And they need to be very, very good at that. And what often happens, in my experience, is instead of being as good at that as they should be, they spend time looking down the slopes of the mountain saying, oh, that group down there at the 500-foot level isn't as productive as I think they should be. So I'm going to reorganize everyone so they'll be more productive. Well,
they're meddling.
And so my not so secret theory is that executives do a lot of damage by deciding that they have to be busy all the time. they I think their job is kind of about making sure that the homeostasis works, that the rest of the system is working well, and that they're looking out for opportunities or threats that you need to adjust to now because they're coming at us, and to see that coming and to figure out how to adjust, which is quite risky and quite scary, actually. I think those jobs at the top are very scary when they're done right. And so to go back to your question about, how does this happen that companies get taken over, people get laid off? I think that's part of it. I think part of it is that the technology, well, this is also we're getting far away from culture, but my theory is that you get a lot of startup money invested in companies that are trying to copy what somebody else has already done. And then you have too many companies trying to do the same thing, and there's going to be some shakeout. Sure.
There's a lot of Me Too companies, just sort of copycats.
Right. And so to go back to the whole issue of culture, it's always a reminder to me that culture isn't the whole story. I mean, culture is a piece of it. And I think you need a strong and healthy culture to get the best talent and to get the most out of the best talent. But you also got to have a vision. You've got to have an idea that's competitive, that's going to work, and you've got to be able to execute.
So I agree with what you're saying, but what I find so fascinating, and I feel like this is just my perception, but it feels to me being as I'm, for example, I was actually just up in San Francisco earlier half this week. I was at a conference, met a whole bunch of people from all over the country. It's actually from all over the world, in fact, who had flown in for this conference and, talking about technology and product and a lot of my favorite topics that I just love to nerd out on. But what was so interesting to me was there was what seemed like the beginnings of a new conversation, much more about culture than I have at least perceived in the past. Now, that could totally be just my perception. That could just be that I don't know, I just wasn't listening, or I wasn't paying attention, or wasn't maybe in the right conversations or spaces. I don't know. But it does feel, at least to me, like something is shifting. And my, we're sort of speculating a little bit. My personal speculation is that it has to do with sort of the rising, we'll call it the rising managerial influence of millennials. Millennials are, before they were dramatically affecting marketing and branding, because a lot of companies were studying them of how do we appeal to this generation. And they saw lots of things about like, okay, this generation really craves aspirational ideals. They crave meaning, they crave purpose, etc. But now they're not just the consumers anymore. They're starting to become, middle managers. Some of them are CEOs now, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a lot of that, generational, I don't even know what the right word is, but the generational kind of zeitgeist that millennials have is starting to show up now in the conversation about like, how do we do what we do? I'm curious, what do you think about that? What do you make of that?
I think that's true. I think there's a part of it. That's part of it. I think there's another part of it, but let me talk about the millennial part of it. I think my experience with millennials has generally been that they're just more outspoken and demanding about the same things that everyone else was
already thinking about,
but didn't demand like as quickly or as clearly. And so they're saying, I want more investment in my career. I want to be able to speak up and say what I think. I want real responsibility. I want the rewards that come from having real responsibility. I want you to tell me what I'm going to be paid. I want to know what my career path looks like. I don't want to rely on somebody in a corner office to take care of my career. Which I think is all good and healthy. And I think organizations have kind of in their own way, taught millennials that this is important, because I think lots of them saw their parents or their grandparents get fired, get laid off, get pushed under abusive managers, or end up in dead-end jobs that they weren't happy with. And so 3 cheers for them to say, no, I'm not going to compromise. This is what I want. Now, I think sometimes they don't stop to really understand, and organizations don't always give them ways to understand what kind of maturity it takes to be a real leader, and how to navigate some of the issues they're going to face, which are where there are no good solutions. And it may look simple from the outside, but you get into it and it's very complex.
Never is, right? It's never easy.
So that's a piece of it. I think the other piece of it, though, is this, especially in the Bay Area, this competition for talent, because there are so many jobs and there aren't as many talented people as there are jobs. And so people are getting called by recruiters. They're getting promised all kinds of things. They're getting wooed and romanced in ways that, who I would, if I were the target of that kind of attention, I'd say, of course I must be this good. Of course I must know what I'm doing. They're offering me a 20% pay increase. I must be good.
It goes to your head, right?
Right. Now, what I don't know is how that dynamic and the millennial values and behavior will change if we go into something like the recession we had in 2008, where suddenly there aren't a lot of jobs. I also don't know much about how millennials are coping with college debt, for example, or coming out of school with just
enormous
no resources to have the kind of life that their parents did coming out of school. And so I'm sensitive to the fact that there's that dynamic out there as well, even though I don't see much of it here in the Bay Area.
Yep. So one thing I'm curious about, you when we were talking about that, you mentioned that millennials, and certainly we're making very blanket statements right now, and there's of course a huge variance inside of these generalizations. But you've observed, it sounds like you've observed that quite a few of the millennials that are wanting to step into the, some real leadership, some real responsibility. I think the words you used was they're not quite, it's not that they're not ready for it, but maybe they're just not emotionally mature enough for it yet. Or you mentioned the word maturity. I'm curious if you could just kind of unpack that a little bit, and then more specifically to make it actionable. How does someone, what I'm thinking about here, what's going through my head is that, the people who are in these situations are probably unaware that they are not ready for it. They just they think they are ready, or they're entitled to it, or something like that. How do you break through to somebody and then get them to hear it? And what is it that they actually need to, what is the growth that actually needs to happen?
So one of the things I've heard over and over again is millennials they trust each other more than they trust the generation ahead of them. And I think I think I understand where that's coming from, because I think they feel that whether it's Generation X or Y or Boomers or whoever, a lot of folks who are in those management and executive seats are staying there and are not creating opportunities for millennials, and are not necessarily very good at investing, mentoring, and giving millennials more to do, or more responsibility, or helping them really understand, here's a situation, let's talk about the trade-offs we have to make here, or here's how this budget works, here are some of the limits and constraints, and let's figure out how to work through this. And then sometimes when millennials come up with ideas and say, well, let's have unlimited vacation, and you get a sort of more traditional manager or chief finance officer or someone like that, operations officer says, no, there's no way we can do that. But then they come out with the Netflix slides and say, well, but Netflix does it.
Yep.
And so it becomes more of a conflict between worldviews, if you want to call them that, and less of a, what are we trying to accomplish? And let's figure out a path forward that works for everybody. And so I can see why millennials would say, that generation is just getting in our way. And that's unfortunate, very unfortunate. On the other hand, I've also seen millennials promoted too quickly and who decide that good management is about taking your team out for beer every afternoon. Now, I'm overstating that a little bit, but I've also seen millennials who had not learned how to separate friendship from managing your former peers. And as a result of not understanding the differences in the role, not being able to have some of the more difficult conversations or even see some of the dynamics in their team because their filter was, these are my friends.
Yeah. That's one of the hardest transitions someone can make, I think, is going from, because it totally changes your entire experience of work, frankly, which is such a core part of our lives. It's not our entire lives, but it's a big chunk. So how do you coach somebody who's in that situation? Let's say you've got a 28-year-old person, a 28-year-old woman who's just been promoted from amongst her, quote, peer group, and is now the manager. And she's, obviously she's very competent. She's very skilled. How would you coach her if you saw her making this, what seems like a fairly common type of mistake of, not understanding roles and boundaries. And that's sort of what I hear in there. What would you do about that? How would you coach that person, assuming they were in fact willing to be coachable and do the work? Just always something.
I always start with, why did you want to be a manager? I mean, I just think it's understanding, why do you want to be a manager? And there are many, many, many different reasons people have. I think the coaching relationship, like any relationship where you have influence but not any formal power, my metaphor for this is surfing, right? So you go out, remember I grew up in Hawaii, so you go out to the beach.
Which island, by the way?
Kauai.
Oh, Kauai, nice.
So you're dragging your surfboard with you, and you're going out, you're paddling out, and then you're sitting there, and you wait for the waves to come. And your job is to be very vigilant, very watchful, very observant, understand what the cadence and the pattern of the waves and the tides and the currents and, of course, the rocks or the sand, whatever it is. But you have to wait for the wave, and then you have to catch the wave. And I think coaching and influence is a lot about being able to see when the other person is catchable, and creating that moment or being there in that moment when that other person is really ready to hear or to consider the questions that you're asking. And so you got to kind of create enough of a relationship so that you can be there at that moment to have that conversation and to make that point or to ask that question and get someone to see it.
What are the signs you look for? How do you know when it is the right moment?
I don't know that I can tell you that. I've just done it for a long time, and I've made enough mistakes. I can tell when I've said something too soon or I've been too direct. People are different. So some people want to just be told directly, and some millennials will say, just tell me how I'm screwing up. Just be direct. I'm not going to understand it if you don't just blurt it out and tell me. And others, they want to figure it out on their own. And there are people who learn that way, and it's kind of trial and error, and it's kind of, don't tell me, let me figure it out. And sometimes it's more about asking them questions or saying, have you considered this? Or let's do a thought experiment. It's another one of my favorite ways to get into things. And help them discover it for themselves. So there's some is the Socratic method, and some is the, were you happy with what just happened there? Because I think you really screwed up, But it depends a lot on the person and the relationship that you've built with them.
Yeah, you have to have that you have to have that background of relatedness, that trust built up enough to have some of these harder conversations, right? You can't, you don't just get to, that's not how relationships work. You don't get to just walk in and be like, bam, here you go. I mean, some people you'll get there faster.
Right.
Are there any, on that note, are there any particular approaches you've seen, whether it's, a book or a resource where you found that you've seen people have good success or, repeatedly kind of learn this skill when they look from this perspective?
So I think the approach that I've used the most and that I've seen most helpful is something called crucial conversations.
Tell me about that.
So
it's a pretty famous book, isn't it?
It's Crucial Conversations: Tools for Talking When Stakes Are High. And they also have can't even remember the name of it. They have a website. They do training, and they do a newsletter, which I get and read religiously. Let me see if I can find it for you.
Crucial Conversations. Okay, we'll definitely put that in the show notes.
Yeah, I think it's, and I don't use everything they've done, but I go back to them over and over and over again. And I just find it to be really helpful, really thoughtful.
Perfect.
And part of it is being vital smarts is what it's called.
Vital smarts.
Okay. Vital smarts.
Another one I've heard a lot of people talk about is Radical Candor by, I believe it's Kim. Is it Kim Scott? I think is her name.
Yeah. I've heard of that. I haven't read it.
Okay.
I think so. That issue, that topic, I have trouble with, because I've been in organizations where I have seen people who were really honest be destroyed. Because you're taking a huge risk. And unless you really are ready to take that risk and ready for everything it means, or you really understand the people you're being honest with, it can backfire. And I've also seen people totally misunderstand it, and particularly executives who think radical candor or transparency is, okay, I just fired the head of sales. Now I'm going to stand up in an all hands meeting and tell everyone I just fired the head of sales because he was falsifying expense reports. Well, this is not a true story, but this is this is something similar to this has happened.
Okay.
And
great.
then you get, well, was that slander? Was it, what are the damages to that person who got fired? Everyone has heard this. They're now spreading it around in the industry. It's going to hurt his reputation. Well, that wasn't, and sure. All in the spirit of, oh, well, we need to be transparent. No, you don't need to be transparent about everything. In fact, it's not helpful to be transparent about everything. Transparency is important for a purpose. But I think there's a certain amount of transparency is important to build trust. But when transparency comes up as a value in organizations, in the work I do, I always tell executives, be sure you explain what the limits are, that you're going to be transparent about the process. You will be transparent about decisions about business decisions, but you will protect the privacy and show respect for individuals involved. And that if there's an individual situation that has led to a particular decision, out of respect for the individual and their feelings and their rights, we're not going to tell you everything that happened. Mm-hmm. And so I think that to me is the right form of transparency. It's saying ahead of time, here's what we're going to be transparent about. Here's what's off limits, and here's why. Mm-hmm. And we're going to extend that same value to you, by the way. So if you're the person who got fired or who has a serious illness, mm-hmm. or whatever it is. Sure. We're just not going to share that with people.
Yeah. I'm hearing you really emphasize, because transparency is another one of those words that gets thrown around so much these days. And you have mm-hmm. to ask, well, okay, what does that actually mean? What does it look like? Mm-hmm. And I think you bring up such mm-hmm. a good point about it. Transparency doesn't necessarily mean 100% disclosure of everything like that. In many cases, that would actually be irresponsible. But it seems like if I'm hearing you right, it's much more about it seems like it's a combination of clarity and fairness, right? In the idea of being upfront with people about what is on the table that you're going to share. It seems like it's really about sharing as much as you can, while still being responsible to certain realities about whether it's individual privacy or sometimes there's regulatory things. If for example, you're doing mm-hmm. a major deal that involves M&A, sometimes there are like legal things that you just can't talk about. An example I've heard that one particular culture I've heard of, although I've never experienced directly, that is, I think probably deals with this a lot is, are you familiar with Bridgewater Associates and Ray Dalio? Mm-hmm. So fascinating place. You might check it out. So Ray Dalio he's pretty much the most successful hedge fund manager ever, in the history of Earth, or which I guess is anywhere, because I don't think there's hedge fund managers on other planets, or if there are, we don't know about them yet. Moving on. So he started this hedge fund called Bridgewater, 30, 40 years ago. They are now mm-hmm. far and away the most successful hedge fund, just not even close. And they have a very, very particular culture. And he put out a book, I think it was 2 years ago, called Principles, that was all about their basically the operating principles that they've come to, and basically how he runs his mm-hmm. life, how they run Bridgewater, because they have such a distinct culture that they are very different than any other normal or typical culture you might find. And one of their big things is this idea of radical transparency, right? And that is so baked into their culture that, it really is radical relative to a typical corporate culture. But even when I say radical transparency, they have practices like, every meeting is recorded and publicly available, right? So there's no secret meetings, right?
But publicly available to whom?
Within the company.
Within the company.
Within the company. And then, and so they have things like that. Everything's publicly available within the company. They have, this is people dealing with very, very sensitive financial information and extraordinary mm-hmm. amounts of wealth. And one of the things, to your point, I'm kind of rambling here, but the reason I thought of it was they also, even within there, they say we're going to be as absolutely transparent as we can be, but here's the edge. There are certain conversations that we won't, because it violates a client's privacy, because it would violate a regulatory requirement around some deal that we're mm-hmm. doing, or something like that. And it seems mm-hmm. by and large that people are okay with that, as long as they're just being told up front. And then you're actually following through on the rest of it.
Right. So I think that's right. I think there are three things that build trust in a culture. One is being open or transparent about process.
Mm-hmm.
So particularly, I think processes involving promotions and pay and things that impact people. I think being consistent in the use of the process so that people see that, okay, you said you were going to do it this way, and this is the way you actually do it.
Mm-hmm.
And the third is having a way to appeal. So if you see something happening that doesn't seem consistent with what the company said it's about or what its process is, there's someplace you can go.
Mm-hmm.
You can say, I want to understand this. This didn't make sense to me. And I want more information. And so I think if those three things are present, whether it's informally or formally or both, I think that creates a perception of fairness. And it starts to create more psychological safety, which I think is critical, is one, but not the whole story behind trust.
I love it, and that's actually I want to let's explore that a little bit more, because I want to actually dig into psychological safety a bit more here. So you mentioned, I think the three you just said were transparency, consistency, and a sort of a mechanism of appeal or further investigation, if you want to call it that. So tell me about psychological safety, because this is another one of these terms that is quickly rising in the larger conversation, certainly within the tech industry. I'm seeing it everywhere. I was at, as I said, I was at this conference earlier this week, fantastic conference. And I went to the leadership forum on Monday, and this was a top line topic. Which I was happy, but surprised to see, pleasantly surprised. It was probably a third of the time was spent on something either directly or closely related to psychological safety. So for people who aren't familiar with that, could you just explain what does that actually mean, and why is this bubbling up so much right now?
Well, what it means is that you work, it's applied to the workplace, but it can be true in any relationship, that in the relationships that you need at work, you feel secure and safe enough to raise difficult issues, things that might be threatening. That's going to be very different for different people. Things that might threaten your job security, might threaten your relationship with your boss or your peers, your work assignments, anything that feels like it's a little risky, a little scary. So, best example in my world is, and this happens a lot, and the Bay Area, we've got people here from all different cultures, many, many different cultures. And they have very different norms around physical space.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And so in some cultures, standing really close to each other is fine. Mm-hmm. And in some cultures, it's very uncomfortable. So this may seem like a trivial example, but then you layer into that gender issues. And so this is at the most sort of innocent level, women from one culture being able to say to men from another culture, you're getting too close to me. Mm-hmm. And having that be okay. Mm-hmm. And that this man from this other culture doesn't take offense at that, doesn't decide this is someone he doesn't need to pay attention to, respects her for saying that, mm-hmm. and then is willing to adjust his behavior as a result. That's psychological safety. It's really hard to do.
Yeah.
And I think people are talking about it a lot because it's like emotional intelligence. It sounds neat and it sounds like, oh yeah, this is a good thing. But making that actually happen in organizations is really, really tough. So I'll give you an example. So in almost all of my clients are right now are small companies
Mm-hmm.
that have somewhere between 25 and 50 employees.
Okay.
And so one of the first things we do is figure out, how are people going to get feedback?
Mm.
And is it going to be a formal process, an informal process, blah, 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 all of that. And one of the things I always put on the table very early on in the design discussion is, are employees going to be able to give their feedback to their managers? So is there going to be 360 or upward feedback?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer to that, so first of all, I'm listening for the CEO and the top executives. What's their answer to that question? And they say, oh, yes, absolutely. We want them to do that. Okay. Most cases, they say, oh, yeah, that's a good thing. Let's do that. Then we roll it out and we say, okay, here's a question on the form. It says, what would you like your manager to do more of? Well, it's actually, what do you appreciate that your manager's doing now? What would you like him or her to do more of? And or do differently?
Okay.
So it's a pretty neutral question, right? It's not saying, what are you doing bad? It's do more of, do differently, do less of. And one easy way to measure psychological safety is to just look at all those answers and see how many people actually wrote anything and how many, and what was the nature of the answer. So you can score them, which I do. Is it all positive? Is it all, I love my manager's great, I've never had such a good manager? Or is there a combination of, my manager's great, I would like my manager to do more of this, or the other? How many risks are people taking in what they're saying back to their manager, knowing that HR will probably see this as well? And that's a way to make this whole notion of psychological safety very tangible. Because you could measure it. You could say, okay, based on this, we think we don't have much psychological safety. People aren't speaking up.
As I'm trying to understand this more, if someone isn't working with a true HR professional, someone who really, knows how to lead these processes, what I'm wondering is, if you're out there and let's say you're, you own or you're a founder of a small company, let's say you've got, 10, 15 people, and maybe you don't have the resources right now to work with somebody like yourself. How can someone in that situation, or even maybe just a manager of a team inside of an organization that wants to use, their team where they have direct influence as sort of a stepping stone to hopefully making a larger cultural change, how can they go about, first of all, assessing this without, what a simplified way of assessing this? And then what do they do about it? How do they actually take action on this?
Well, I would start by reading the Crucial Conversations book, because they have a whole chapter. I mean, that's one of the themes, is how do you create psychological safety so that you can talk about risky, scary things? And so I think there's a lot of foundation there. But the other thing, I guess I'd have two recommendations, particularly for founders. So I have consistently, with very few exceptions, seen that founders are confused about how other people see them.
Say more about that.
And they tend to think that they tend to underestimate how much fear they can create in other people just by the nature of being the founder who's getting the money to create the company, who can basically say, I don't like you, go away. And even though the founder has no intention of doing that, they still have that power.
Yep.
And once they start talking to investors and getting money and getting it organized and having lawyers and talking about cap tables and controlling interest and all that stuff, all of a sudden they are in a different world. And the 5 people that they used to sit around bullshitting around about technology and, who's coding this and, isn't this cool? Those conversations just change fundamentally. And so that collegial give and take, kind of we're just buddies sitting around in a garage goes away. It just changes.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of founders who don't realize that or want to think that they can recreate or go back to that buddies sitting around in the garage. And once there's a power differential in an organization, that changes the terms of psychological safety. And it means the founders have to do a lot more work to create and maintain psychological safety. And it's often hard for them.
No, please. I was just going to say, once if someone realizes they have this challenge, right? Things have gotten serious, right? And it's sort of moved beyond the, hey, it's a couple of us, couple buddies hanging out in the garage, and now it's real, right? Maybe you've taken investor money, maybe you're inside a bigger organization, and you pitched a big project, and it got greenlit, and now you're on the hook for this thing. What is someone in that situation to do? How should they actually go about creating the psychological safety? Is there like I'm sure there's many things, but where would you have them start?
Before I answer that question, one thing I point out, because I think it's practical and helpful. So when you're a founder, or to your point, you get a big project, you're part of a bigger company, generally you're getting shares, you're getting equity, or you're getting a bonus. There is some payoff that's different for you than it is for everybody else. And usually that's not a big secret.
Okay.
Eventually people find out. So don't try to hide it, but don't flaunt it either. I mean, don't go in and talk about the new Tesla that you're picking up, or having delivered to you that night. Yeah.
Don't be that.
I've seen too many.
Don't be that guy.
Don't be that guy. Yeah.
Okay. So what would the next step be?
And so the next step is, I would say on some level, you have to go back to the individuals that you were closest to, and either one-on-one, usually probably one-on-one, but maybe in a group setting, say, look, I know that I'm in a different role now. And I know that that's going to impact our relationship, because there are going to be some decisions I know about that you're not going to know about, or that I'm going to be part of making and you're not going to be part of making. So you kind of have to acknowledge the reality first. And then you say, but I want you to know that your input, your point of view, your ideas, the creative process that we share together is really important to me, and we can't be successful without that. So you have to go back and say, here's how I value our relationship and your individual contribution. And here's what you mean, not just to this company we're creating or this project we're working on, but to me personally. And I want to preserve, and then you can talk about the kind of communication you want to preserve and say, I need you to challenge me. I need you to tell me when I've got my head in the sand, or worse. I need you to tell me when you think I'm going in the wrong direction. I may not always agree with you. And I may know some things that you don't know, but I will always value and listen to what you have to say to me. And I think having that kind of conversation and really meaning it, not doing it because, there's a script and you heard it on a podcast and it sounded good.
Because Becky told you.
But really meaning it and being sincere and genuine about it.
Yeah.
Now, the next part of it, and this is the even harder part, is there comes a time in almost every venture when one of the original 5 or 7 doesn't fit anymore.
Yeah.
And in my experience, everybody knows that weeks, sometimes months before the founder does anything about it.
Huh.
Even the person who knows that he doesn't belong anymore, it's usually a he or she doesn't belong anymore, is waiting for the CEO, the founder, to do something about it. And the founder is typically the person who takes too long. And I think part of it is because the founder often doesn't know how to have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have that conversation in a very respectful, genuine, honest way.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to have it.
This is such a juicy topic because, you know, this to me is a paradox, and which is why I'm so intrigued by it. Because on the one hand, if psychological safety means having that sense of safety and belonging, which is sort of what are sort of the prerequisites to have those, to take those risks, right? To put yourself out there, to say, hey, I don't know about this, to disagree, almost like it's safe to have conflict. How then? So where does belonging fit into all this? Like, you know, what is it you see that happens where this particular person no longer fits anymore? Is it just that the culture has changed? Is it that what the company needs is different now? What is it that usually causes this kind of thing?
There are a bunch of different things, but remember, I think it's really important when you're talking about psychological safety. What is safe? So none of our jobs are safe. Jobs are never safe. Even the CEO's job, the board, the investors could come in and say, sorry, we think you're
out.
You know, not the right person. Yep. You're out. So the job is never safe. The company is never safe. What is safe, what can be safe, are the relationships, because that's what we control. And so when I think about psychological safety, I think about, is my relationship with you or with this team solid enough that is the relationship solid enough, and do I have the skills that I need to raise difficult topics with you in a way that's respectful but honest? And so there are two things there. There's the relationship we built over time, but there's also the skills I have and the skills I believe you have. And that's why I think if you want to create psychological safety in an organization, you have to invest a lot of time in how to talk about things, how to set it up, how to communicate and practice it. And at the end of the day, it's not about promising anyone safety for their job. I mean, someone comes to me and says, I have falsified test data on a medical device. No one's getting psychological safety for that. Sorry.
Yeah.
That's an integrity issue.
That's a major deal.
Yeah. Or someone, but if someone comes to me and says, you know, I was supposed to deliver test results. Well, in my case, the kinds of things I work on, I was supposed to get you this data for a pay review by Monday, and I screwed up and I did the analysis wrong, and I have to redo it, and it's not going to be ready until Friday. Okay. Now, I'm going to react to that very differently than I would react to someone coming in and saying I falsified the data that was sent to the FDA.
Yeah, very different situation.
Right. One is like, we got to scramble to rearrange timelines. The other jeopardizes the entire company and could jeopardize patients. So totally different dimensions of risk. So I think I think that's what you have got to remember to solve the paradox, is that psychological safety is more about the relationship than it is about, am I going to get to keep my job or not? Because that's just, it's apples and oranges, I think. So psychological safety is my relationships are solid enough that I can raise difficult, sensitive issues early before, while there are still many degrees of freedom for solutions
to do something about it. Yeah. So let's imagine, I want to make this concrete. So let's imagine you've got someone who, so one of the things that, let me take a step back. I've personally become very interested in culture for a number of different reasons, but I mean, the biggest one is very similar to how you got interested in it. Is for me, we spend so much of our lives at work, and I'm committed to having people who spend their time in an environment that brings out the best in them, that helps them be more alive because of what they do, not less alive because of what they do. And which is actually where the title of this show came from in the first place. My question though is, as I've started to explore these topics, one of the common refrains I've heard from people who know much more about this topic than I do is something to the effect of, if you don't have senior leadership, and this is really more about just cultural change in general, but I think it probably applies here, which is, if you don't have, senior leadership on board, just don't even bother. Don't waste your time. Like, if they're not even interested in a change like this happening, you're just going to beat your head against the wall, burn out, and get super frustrated and leave. So I guess it's a really two-part question. First of all, do you think that's actually true based on what you've seen? And then my second question is, if that's true, let's say you're someone in a situation where the larger environment is not ideal, just put it that way, and you are feeling very much at risk and you want to do something about it. How should you approach that if you're not feeling safe in that environment? You're not feeling like, wow, I can really say this to my boss. Because of your experience of the larger environment. Is it worth it? Should you? How do you? Or is that whole thing I just said, is that just actually a really fancy excuse for just not taking a risk?
I think that's an excellent question. And it's got so many dimensions to it. But one of the people who had the most influence on my thinking and my practice early in my career, it's a guy named Peter Block.
Okay.
Who you don't hear his name as much anymore. I think he died years ago. But he wrote a book called The Empowered Manager. And the basic premise of this book was, you are responsible for yourself. And you're accountable for the work environment you create around yourself. And you have more power than you realize you do. And if you use what executives and other people are doing as an excuse, then you are sort of condemning the whole organization to its lowest common denominator often. And he said, don't be naive. Don't be stupid. I mean, don't be self-destructive. But find ways to take a stand. And particularly if you're a manager or a director, use the power that you have in the context, in the area where you have responsibility, to be more open, to create more psychological safety. These are not all or nothing. It's not off or on. There's a process, and there's degrees and steps, and try things and see what kind of results you get. And then give it some time and wait and see. But do it because you're doing it for yourself. I mean, I think part of doing meaningful work is knowing that we are acting in a moral way, in a way that gives us personal integrity. I don't know that we talk about that enough these days, but I think that's a piece of it.
Yeah.
And it means if you see something that you think isn't working right, well, I would start with, if you see something that you think could work better, so you're not sort of telling someone they're blaming or attacking someone, try that first. Hey, do you think we could, if we did it this way, would this be better? Or can we work together on this in a way that would improve it or make it go faster? So start with, how can you connect with people to make things better, and see how they respond. And then as you build those relationships and that kind of practice or those habits, then you can start raising questions like, well, that process or that relationship or the way we've been communicating about those issues just doesn't feel right to me. It feels like it's like getting stuck all the time. This is where crucial conversations comes in really handy, because it gives you ways of thinking about how to introduce these topics that are designed to not attack. They're designed to be sort of observational and not so judgmental.
Not put people on the defensive.
Exactly. So then you see how people respond, and then you can slowly, kind of grow the discussion.
Yeah. No, this is interesting. So one of the things that one of the things it brings up for me as I'm listening to you and I'm reflecting on a lot of other conversations I've had around this topic is it kind of goes back to this idea of belonging or cultural fit. And I heard someone just the other day, actually at that conference, I've said it so many times, I should say what conference it was, by the way. It was the Mind the Product conference. It was great. Highly recommend it. So we were there, and there was a guy named Matt LeMay who does some really interesting consulting work. And he was talking about this topic as well as a few other things. And one of the things that he said that I made me laugh at the time, but it really stuck with me. And I'm still chewing on it. This has only been a few days now. Was he said he doesn't like the term cultural fit or culture fit. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And he said more. He said and I'm paraphrasing here. This is not exactly what he said, but it was something to the effect of, when you say, oh, that person's not a culture fit or something like that, it's sort of implying that it's the onus is on that person. I think he was mostly referring to this in the context of hiring. Let's say you're talking about a candidate for a position. He was saying, when you say, oh, that person's not a culture fit or something like that, you're saying, it's on that person to fit into our sort of pre-existing structure, almost like a puzzle piece, right? They have to fit some mold, and that he doesn't think that's right. And that what he said he prefers is the idea of culture add. And the idea that this person will bring something to us that maybe we don't have already. They'll challenge us in productive ways. And I've just found myself in the days since then thinking, just sort of percolating on this idea of like culture fit, culture add, belonging. Where does this all come together? How does someone know? And maybe we can segue into that in a minute here. Is, let's say you're either at a place you just started working or you're considering joining a place. How do you know if you are a culture fit, if you belong there, whatever phrase, whatever wording you'd like to use?
Yeah, I actually think it's really important if you're a candidate, and this goes back to the first conversation we had. If you're a candidate, you have to be assessing, is this a culture, and I would use the word match. Are you going... Is this culture going to be good for you? Is it going to bring out the best in you, or not? And I think a lot of it goes to questions around how the culture handles setbacks and frustrations. And setbacks can come because a competitor wipes out, some of your market share, because you missed a technology leap, or it could be because the team didn't execute well. so there are all kinds of reasons why the culture can have issues. But, well, you were saying, what you had, one of the reasons you'd gotten into this was because of all the time we spend at work and making it meaningful. And I think going back to an earlier theme, one of the things about millennials is they do care a lot about their relationships with each other.
Yeah.
And
definitely.
And work doesn't trump that. Where, with, I think, my parents' generation, and even to some extent my generation, and we had friends at work, but work was considered more important than friendships.
Okay.
When we were at work. And I think it's different with millennials. I think some of them think my relationships at work with my colleagues there are just as important as my relationships, as my work. They kind of come together. And that creates something very different about the culture. And I think sometimes it scares managers, because I think managers see millennials as, well, they're all going to stick up for each other, and they're like one group. And so we can't sort of tease them apart, or we can't treat one differently than the other.
Millennial gang.
Yeah. And I don't know if that's really true, but I think some managers perceive it that way.
It's really interesting what you're saying about and it's something I've been wondering about as well. Since technically I think I am a millennial by like 2 years or something. But the idea of, I think what I'm really hearing in what you're saying is the idea of how personal work is. Like that it's almost,
I think that's right. Yeah.
And when I say that, I don't mean, what I'm not trying to say is that to people who are not millennials, that like work didn't matter to them, right? Or that it wasn't deeply personally meaningful. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to get at is, it seems like if I'm reading the tea leaves right, and I don't know if I am, that millennials want to, the kind of overused, the almost trite phrase right now is like to bring their whole selves to work, right? They want to want to bring more of their personal self, their full self, beyond what they do at the office, into the office. They want to be able to have conversations at work that are not just professional development, but like whole person development, right? It's when I've had, I've coached a lot of people in my various roles, and some of those conversations were, there was only so deep we could go in the coaching conversation, and there was like kind of a floor there. That person was not willing to go beyond that. And okay, I respect that. I'm biased in this sense. I just want to disclose, like, be upfront about my bias. My perception of those coaching relationships was that that limit they were putting, that like edge that they would not go across, was actually limiting their growth professionally as well. Like, because they couldn't, there was just some place they weren't willing to go. They weren't willing to talk about or be seen, something like that. They're like, wait, that's in my personal life. It has nothing to do with the office. And it's like, well, you're still the same person. Like, that stuff going on in your personal life, you brought it with you when you showed up today, It didn't just stop, and vice versa. Like, and you have a bad day at the office, which happens, it goes with you home or wherever you go after work. And so I'm curious if you've seen anything like that in terms of I don't know the right terms for this, but the level of comfort maybe that people of different generations have, or maybe it's a preference for how personal things are allowed to be. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, like where the boundaries are.
Yeah.
So here's where it's, I think, tricky. Up to a certain point, sharing information with colleagues about maybe personal doubts or personal beliefs, or personal style choices can be helpful, and it's good to get different points of view, and it creates some sense of closeness and supportiveness. And that can be very meaningful and very positive and very motivating. And it can keep people in an organization. It can keep them connected and loyal and attached to the organization. The risk is when it goes off the rails, when someone, I deal with situations like this more often than I'd like. Someone has a substance abuse problem.
Mm-hmm.
Someone has now it's an emotional disorder of some kind. And now we're getting into disability territory.
Sure.
And it becomes really complicated because it creates this tension or this conflict between the person's ability to do their job and the job that needs to be done. Mm-hmm. And so you're their confidant, you're on their team, and they're telling you, I can't come to work on time, or whatever the issue is.
Sure.
And now, what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to say, "I'll cover for you"? I'll take care of it for you because I'm your friend, or do you say it's time to let HR know, or it's time to let the manager know this has become an issue? That's where it gets tricky. Or there's a romance developed, or it becomes more than just friendship. So I think that's where it's just, I think the ideal is right. I respect that and appreciate it, but there are going to be enough cases where it creates real dilemmas in the organization, and not just for the organization, but for individuals in that team, in that social circle. So we were talking about millennials and boundaries. And I actually think that what naturally has happened with every cohort, every one of these sort of generational groups, is as their lives change, they get married, or they have children, or they settle down in different ways, that other part of their life kind of replaces some of what they were getting from work.
Yeah.
I don't know that will happen as much with millennials as it might have with the boomers or Generation X or Y, but it's certainly, I think it's likely, and I'm sort of starting to see that in some of the places where I work. I think they're always going to have a different relationship with work, in part because they have come into the workplace at a time when there were so many people ahead of them. And it's been, and there's been a gig economy, and there've been different jobs, and the millennials move around so much. I mean, 18 months in a job is pretty normal. And when I was coming up, if you hadn't been in a job for 10 years, there was something wrong with you. So it's changed a lot. It's changed a lot.
Big difference.
Yeah.
So if I'm hearing you right, what do you think you're perceiving is, what I think I'm hearing is that, like, as people get older and they start to get married, have families, be farther along in their careers, that sort of maybe the scope of their life broadens, and there's just more going on in their life.
Yeah.
And so work plays a relatively smaller part, still an important part, but it's not like 98% of their day to day anymore. Is that what you're getting at?
That, and I'd add that as they move around, because they don't stay in one company for a long time. Their social circle outside of work tends to be composed of people they've worked with at different companies. So that's who they hang out with. So all
their friends are former coworkers.
Right. And then you'll find that they will say, okay, I'm going to leave this job to go to another job because that's where a friend of mine or someone I really liked is working now. And so they'll move jobs in part because they want to continue to work with people they like.
Yep.
And that was certainly not true of my generation or generations before the millennials.
Gotcha. That's interesting. So that kind of comes back to that idea we were talking about culture match, of, how people match with or don't match with a culture. So how should someone who's going through this process, how should they think about culture match? Let's use that term, belonging. And then I think really it opens up the question of, if you're assessing a culture, right? Let's say you're interviewing or thinking about interviewing with a company, how do you do it? And so that you get you get a good match.
Yeah. So I think there are two things. One, a lot of the folks I'm interviewing now, one of the questions I always start with is, well, why are you interested in company X? And it's amazing how often they'll say, oh, I know somebody who works there, or my cousin works there, or my roommate's best friend is going out with so-and-so who works there.
Sure.
So they're talking to each other and they have a network, and it doesn't matter what you say in the all hands meeting or what posters you have on the walls. They have their own brand and their own perceptions of what the culture is. And so I think if you're a hiring manager or you're in HR, you're worrying about attracting talent, you need to know what the word on the street is about your company and how things get done. But secondly, to your second part of your question, I'd say when you're interviewing, ask people and don't ask HR, because HR is going to give you sort of the prescribed answer. I mean, you can ask them, but be a little...
Ask somebody else too.
Yeah, right. Get some reliability data. There are two basic questions. One is, how do you celebrate success? And what is success in your company? How do you define what success is and how do you celebrate it? And then I'd listen and see, okay, is it like individual team level? Is it big company level? Is it formal? Is it informal? So I'd really try to get an understanding of that. Is it spontaneous? Is it full of joy, or is it kind of formal and structured and, managed by accountants, whatever? So that's the first question.
Or do they celebrate at all?
At all. Yeah. Right.
Some places just don't.
Right. They're real hard edged and kind of, yeah. And then the second question is, how do you deal with setbacks? And part of that is, depending on who I'm talking to, I want to know, in the team or in the science or among the engineers, or in marketing. So each function has a kind of a different flavor of what a setback is. But then if I'm talking to a manager or someone more senior, I'd want to know, well, what happens, what have been the major setbacks in the last 12, 24 months, and how has the company dealt with them? Because what you're trying to understand is how open, how transparent, how much do they pull the whole company together to respond to a setback? How much do they try to isolate it? How much of setbacks get buried under the waterline, and how much are they, above the waterline? And I think those two questions, one's more on the positive, one's more on the, adversity, but they're a nice way to begin to understand the culture. And they're questions that people don't ask enough. I mean, people come in and I say, do you have any questions? And they turn the page and they've got like 5 questions and they're all totally predictable. tell me about the culture.
Yeah. What are people asking that are waste of time, or they should, what are they asking that they shouldn't be asking, or what should they ask instead?
Yeah. So they say, well, the culture is really important to me. What kind of culture do you have? And I just say,
Okay.
I mean, I can answer that question any way you want me to answer it. I just think that doesn't give me a sense that it gives me a sense that they've taken that out of a how to interview book and not really thought about it. So I'd say it's more important for them to create some context around it that says, I really thrive in, or I do my best in certain kinds of cultures and not in others. And I'm really curious. I want to understand what your culture is like. Then they should also be asking questions about the manager they'll be working for and say, okay, tell me about what that manager's style is. How does he or she communicate? What does he or she, how do they set expectations, that kind of stuff. You can ask HR about benefits, and a lot of people do, and I think that's important, but it's certainly not, to me, it's not a make it or break it, because most companies are competitive when it comes to benefits. The question that people often ask that I really like is, why do you work here? And why are you excited about coming to work here? And so it's kind of personal, and it gets at, you can't really give a canned answer to that question.
Yeah, you can't fake that one.
Yeah.
There's no scripting in that one.
Yeah.
That's interesting. What are some other ones that actually, it seems like the first thing you would need to do is break out of the canned questions and answers, right? So you can have an actual conversation with whoever you're talking to. But are there some other areas that are, you think, overlooked that, people don't dig into enough in that interview process? And so that later on, I think in our previous call, one of the things you said to me was something like, one of the most common regrets, or one of the most common statements that people who regret the job they took, or regretful job takers, say is, it wasn't what I thought it would be. It wasn't what they led me to believe. And I'm curious if you could just unpack that a little bit more, and then how people could avoid that, really, so that people are getting better matches on both sides.
So the question people should ask is, how is this job changing? One is, why is this job open? Is it a new position, or is it a replacement for someone who was here? And then I'd say, how do you see this job changing or evolving over the next 12 months? Is this, and I'd kind of set it up as, I get the sense this is a really dynamic company where there's a lot going on. And I want to know, how you think this job might change as a result of that over the next 6 months, and how the priorities might change. And you can kind of say, I'm not trying to pin you down because I know it's a prediction, but if you had to speculate, what are going to be the biggest drivers of change in this role, or in the priorities for this role?
How do you, I love what you're saying here. One of the things that occurs to me is that an assumption, I think one of the things that at least I'm assuming is necessary to do this well, if you're the candidate, right, the person interviewing for a role somewhere, is you've got to really, you really have to know yourself. You have to understand where you actually thrive and where you don't. And that seems to me like one of those, it's a little bit of a catch-22, right? Like you almost don't know where you don't thrive until you have that experience. And then you go, man, that sucked. I don't want to do that again. Right. So other, are there, I know there's all sorts of the common tools that are probably out there, but how do you recommend people understand that better so that they can actually know what they actually need and want and respond to in an environment? So
the best thing to do is ask the people who've worked the closest with you. And so if you've had a boss or manager who you really respected and you thought you really worked well together, ask that person, say, hey, can you help me understand, from your perspective, you've worked with lots of people over your career. Working with me, give me some insight into what you thought I responded best to and what seemed to deflate or just not engage me. And so get some feedback from some other people, have some hypotheses about yourself, and see where the matches are.
That's a great idea. I never thought it's so obvious, but it's totally a great idea. I've never. Now I want to go do that.
You should.
I want to ask everyone I've ever worked with, like, hey, what did I respond well to, and what did I, what took the wind out of my sails?
Right.
No, it's fascinating. That's fascinating because it seems like also, are there other? Maybe this goes back to psychological safety, but one of the things that this is probably one of those unfair characterizations of, particularly of large companies, but it's probably true for large organizations anywhere of any type. But you think about situations where, going all the way back to early in this conversation, we talk about where a lot of the iceberg is underwater, right? Where there's like what is presented and then there's what's real, and there's a pretty big gap between the rhetoric and the reality. Are there other questions that people can ask or things that they can do to really kind of almost test the level there to see, hey, really how where is that level? How much above? Like, how do you tell from the outside how much of the iceberg is above or below the waterline? I think is actually what I'm asking here.
So I don't think you're going to get it from interviews. Okay. Because generally, I think companies are pretty careful about who you talk to in an interview. But most companies do reference checks, and I think candidates should do the same thing. And it's kind of a ask your network. Poke around, do Google searches on some of the top executives, read what Glassdoor says. Glassdoor, any single entry in Glassdoor is suspect, but as a general trend,
looking for patterns.
Looking for patterns.
It's like Yelp reviews, right? One bad Yelp review, whatever. But you see 30 of them, you're like, something weird here.
And in Glassdoor, you can, because they identify the function of the person giving the review, you can kind of figure out, okay, if you're a software engineer, go look at what the software engineers say. And it might be different from what the marketing people say. But but sometimes if a company is changing a lot, you're going to get it's just going to be very dynamic. And if you're joining a company and one of the things to ask is, how is the company changing? Are they going through a business model pivot? Are they trying to change their culture? If I hear them talk about a change program, then I want to know more about that and how it impacts me, because inevitably, if you're doing a lot of change, there is going to be a gap between the rhetoric and the reality. But that's what you kind of have to do that as part of creating change. That's different.
Do candidates ever asked to talk to the person who, like, let's say it's a replacement. You said why is this role open? Maybe it's a new thing, in which case never mind. But let's say it's a replacement. Do candidates ever say, like, can I talk to the person who left?
Well, if the person who was in the job got promoted or transferred, often they're part of the interview process. Or I'm happy for them to have that conversation.
But if they left the company.
If they left the company, it depends on the conditions.
Sure. Let's say it was a voluntary departure.
Yeah. They left because their spouse moved to Michigan and they went with them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. I'd say, sure, we're happy to do that.
Gotcha. You think it would be considered a red flag if you asked that and then the company said no? Is that actually a red flag, or is that sort of reading a problem where there actually may not be?
It's hard to tell. I'd say it's probably reading a problem. I think, look, what I tell candidates is, if you really know yourself and you're working on being authentic, yourself, you're going to, at the same time, get better and better at picking up authenticity from others. And if you spend if you meet 6 people in an interview day and you walk away saying, I think, 5 of them were giving me canned answers or hadn't really prepared for the interview or didn't seem to know what they were doing, that's a red flag.
Yeah,
a big flag.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned to me in our last call, sorry, was that not only is it understanding like what's the process for this role, how's it changing, and what the company's really looking for in this role, but it was really about seeing like how thoughtful is this company, like do they actually know what they want?
Yes, exactly.
Like probably a lot of companies probably actually don't, which is sort of surprising. If you're from the candidate side, you assume they do, but I guess not. That's so interesting.
Because they've got a to-do list of 100 things and a key person has left and they have to fill the position. And they often don't stop to think carefully about how the position has changed, what are the priorities. And if they have a really strong HR function, HR might push them and get them to do that. But sometimes, unfortunately, companies that don't really care a lot about their culture or their people will take a lot of shortcuts.
One of the places I want to start to wrap it up here is that I'm really curious about, as you mentioned, companies that have a strong HR function, right? And you follow that with companies that really care about their culture. I could see the assumption being made that if you like, if one, then the other is likely to follow, but the inverse is not true, right? You might have really great HR people, but not at your company. Leadership may not actually care that much about your culture, even if they say something to otherwise. But I imagine if you really actually care about your culture, you would be much more likely to have a strong HR function. But it
depends on the company size. So when you're really small, like 20 employees, you can do it on your own. If you care and you read, and there are books and there are people out there like yourself who, think about this and practice it. Once you get up to 30, 35 employees, you're starting to, your culture is creating itself, whether you like it or not. And you really need someone to help you focus on it and keep you honest about it. And so that's why I work with a number of companies that are really small, like around 20 employees. And my sole purpose, well, I have a few other things I do, but largely it's around helping them think about their culture and helping them practice it as they grow. And sometimes that's like 4 hours a week. Sometimes it's 8 hours a week. It's not a ton of time, but it's being in the right place at the right time to have the right conversation.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's funny. I think you actually just answered, you answered my next question, which was, what I'm imagining is, I think the HR function, I think that people who don't work in the HR function undervalue it. And they undervalue culture. I mean, it's one of the reasons that culture is going to be a very major theme of it is a major theme of this show. Like, this show started as a product management podcast, right? But it's broadening and evolving into much more of, yes, that's an important part about like not only the products that we make, but then very quickly you get into, okay, well, how do you make those products? And then right there, you're at culture. And so that's how culture really came into the conversation. And so one of the things I find myself wondering, and I'm curious if you've seen this or have any thoughts, is let's say you're a small company, right? Say 10 to 20 people, let's call it that, right? So you're out of the absolutely nascent phase, of like three people around a kitchen table, but you're not like a full blown big company yet. Yeah. And let's leave the outliers like Instagram out of this one. What argument would you make, or what would you, if you were to try to convince those people and say, like, here's why you should be investing now in HR and in culture, because they have so many other things on their plate that feel like they're, way more urgent, more important, like whether it's raising the next round, getting the next version of the product out, et cetera, et cetera. What would you say to those people to say, like, yes, this is actually worth your precious time right now?
So do you care about how things get done?
Yes.
Okay, then you care about culture. And if you're not thinking about it intentionally, it's going to happen to you unintentionally. And it's going to happen as a result of sort of the amalgam of the people you hire. And if you're hiring them just for some technical skill they have without regard to their integrity, to their communication skills, to their positive problem solving, then you're going to get what you get. And the odds are that some of those folks are going to be corrosive, toxic, competitive in a bad way. And that's going to have an impact on everyone. You may not see it in the first year, you may not see it in the second year, but you'll see it in the third or fourth year. It will drive turnover. It will slow you down. Your resources won't be as aligned or as productive or as creative, and you'll have a hard time attracting talent.
So to sort of paraphrase Brene Brown's latest Netflix special, you either do culture or culture does you.
Yeah, something like that.
something like that, and by the time you're at the effect of it, if you weren't intentional, it's probably going to hurt a lot. Is my guess.
Yeah.
I'm convinced that culture change is probably the hardest problem in business. It's so much more complicated than even something incredibly complex like building and shipping a product.
Partly because if you haven't been paying attention to it, it's happening unintentionally. It's the iceberg is under the ice, not just under the waterline, not just for candidates, but for employees, for everybody. And it's really hard to know how to get things done, or the way you get things done comes at a very high personal, emotional cost. Yeah,
the experience sucks.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a technical term.
Technical term. Experience sucks. Love it. I love it. Yeah. So before I ask my last question, where can anybody who's following this and wants to go deeper, where can they connect with you online, or is there anywhere you direct them to that you want them to put their energy if they want to follow up and learn more or connect with you?
LinkedIn. It's fine. It's probably the easiest way. And I'd also say, look, I'm not marketing myself. I'm happy to share with people and share books and sort of forums and things I think will be helpful. But I'm not trying to. I'm not on Twitter.
Totally.
I'm not on Twitter, and I will never be on Twitter.
All right, perfect. No, just thought I would ask in case there's somewhere you wanted people to, some door you did want to open.
Yeah.
So I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it up with just one rapid fire question, which is if you, it's rapid fire in the sense the question is short. Your answer doesn't have to be. You can take as long. You can go as long as you want, but the question is intentionally trying to be short. But if you could have someone who's a leader in an organization that's listening to this make just one change in their culture that you think would have the biggest impact in creating an enlivening work environment, what change would you have them make?
Listen better. So I think most executives, most people in organizations in life don't listen well enough. And so learning how to listen better, because just the act of listening is an act of validating and appreciating the other. And that creates meaningful relationships. It creates respect. And it leads to psychological safety, which I think leads to trust. And that just leads to good things for people personally, for relationships, and for businesses.
Perfect. Well, on that, I just want to say thank you so much for coming. And honestly, it's been such a fun conversation, and we've gotten to cover actually an enormous amount of ground. I literally had pages of notes of things I wanted to talk about, and we actually hit a huge number of things. Good. I'm so glad. Which is a wonderful surprise because that almost never happens. But this has been so much fun, Becky. Thank you for your time and for just coming and being so open and generous with your expertise and your experience, and helping us all do what we're here to do. So thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. Lots of fun for me too.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on iTunes. That helps us reach way more people and build this community up. For show notes, links to the resources, and everything else we discussed, please go to enliven.fm. Feel free to reach out with questions, feedback, or just to say hello by emailing connect@enliven.fm. Be sure to subscribe, and until next time, my friends, leave them better than you found them. We'll see you soon.